Apple's finally got a streaming music service, but should you tune in?
And how can you get your legit Game of Thrones fix now that the season's over? Welcome to Vertical Hold, the tech show where we channel surf through the headlines in search of the big picture. I'm Adam Turner, and I'm here with a character that George R.R. Martin would never dare kill off, Alex Kidman. Alex, what's new in tech?
Microsoft and Sony have held their big E3 press events, showing off impressive new titles due to hit their next generation consoles, as well as looking back at the past. In Microsoft's case, that includes Xbox 360 compatibility for a bunch of games, up to 100 by the end of the year, so they claim. Whereas in Sony's case, highlights included a PS4 remake of perennial fan favourite Final Fantasy VII, as well as helping to launch a Kickstarter to develop Shenmue 3.
Online pay TV service Fetch TV has launched its own download to own option, letting it sell HBO blockbusters like Game of Thrones which aren't available in its subscription library. Fetch TV customers will also be able to purchase new release movies before they're available on DVD.
Woolworths is having another stab at mobile telephony, launching Woolworths Connect, a virtual mobile service running on Telstra's network. Woolworths' previous offering ran on Optus. This one will run on parts of the 3G network, the same way that Aldi Mobile does.
Users of password management service LastPass should change their master password after the service fell victim to hackers. Hackers didn't get their hands on an open list of passwords, but user email addresses and password hints were compromised. So Alex, LastPass has had another security breach. Is this something to be worried about?
That's definitely something to be worried about, same as with any security breach, but
Yeah.
For a password manager, it's particularly problematic because the whole point of using a password manager, and I certainly do still advise people use password managers, is that it keeps all your other accounts secure because you're not doing that classic blunder of using the same password across multiple sites, and most of these applications can generate nice, strong passwords for you, keeping them all secure behind a single password. So yeah, there's reason to be worried here, although LastPass are saying the predictable things that almost anyone says when there's a security breach. That not a large number of accounts were accessed, that they shouldn't be able to get hold of your actual passwords.
Yeah, there's
but
not raw passwords. Yeah,
it does appear that some passwords and possibly some password hints have been leaked. They've been a little bit vague about the exact details around this.
Yeah.
For LastPass, though...
Pro tip for those of you playing along at home, when it asks, what is your favourite food? Never say pizza. 20% of English speakers say pizza, so they've got a 1 in 5 chance of guessing that. Never put pizza as your favourite food. That's a public service announcement.
See, my public service announcement around that is that whenever you're asked a question like that, think of a faintly ludicrous answer that you will remember. So if you're asked what your favourite food is, you say it's Suzanne Vega. But that works beautifully, as long as you remember it, of course. But the thing is, this isn't, as you said in the intro, this isn't the first time LastPass has been hacked. And I think for them it's particularly problematic because they're not the only game in town. There's KeyPass, there's Dashlane, there's 1Password. There's lots of other applications out there that do not appear to have had this kind of hacking problem. And while LastPass are advising its users to change their master password, I'd say that you might want to actually look at whether or not it was worth changing to a different password manager this time around.
So, Alex, does Apple have what it takes to out-Spotify?
Well, maybe. I mean, it certainly put them on the spot with the launch of Apple Music.
You see what he did there? That was beautiful.
That was slick. That was. They wouldn't have noticed if you hadn't said anything.
No, sorry, I ruined it.
Now the moment is gone.
Pretend it never happened.
Okay, so with Apple Music, Apple is not, despite what it might want to claim, being revolutionary here. It's coming in as a late practitioner.
Say it's not true.
Sadly, it's true. It's true. They're coming in as a late entrant into this field, but Apple does this a lot, and it has a lot of success with it. Apple Music, to me, it's interesting in some parts, and it's very much, everyone else does that in others. I mean, they've got weird things like this global radio station that they seem very keen on pushing, and it's like, well,
because it's their only key differentiator. That's why.
Been done.
It's the only thing that they do that Spotify doesn't, though. That's the thing.
Yeah, but I mean, you can get internet radio from anywhere on the planet through apps that have existed for more than a decade now. This in itself is not a new key differentiator, no. But I think you're actually ignoring Apple's actual differentiator here.
Which is?
And Apple's actual differentiator is that it's tying this all into iTunes, which means it's the default and it can pimp it relentlessly to the hundreds of millions of iTunes users it's already got. In one sense, it launches with more of a market than Spotify already has, as long as it can get those folks to actually continue on beyond whatever free trial period they're going to offer here in Australia. Now, I should point out that as we're recording this, Apple has yet to actually announce Australian pricing. The US pricing for single user is basically on par with Spotify, but there's also a family pack, which actually is where it might also be kind of competitive because it's multi-user for a price actually per user that is quite a bit lower than Spotify's equivalent.
It looks like if you've got more than 2 people in your household using the account, that you might get better value for money from Apple Music than from Spotify.
It's possible, but again, that depends on what the local pricing here ends up being, or whether or not they bring the family offering here at all. It's always possible they might just go, nope, single user here because that's the licenses we've got with the local music rights holders. And of course, this is always the tricky business for Apple, that it sits as the middleman between the music rights holders and the people who want to listen to that music. Same as they do with video. It's slightly different with apps, of course.
Yes, but this is another selling point actually that Apple has. It's going to have a handful of people like Taylor Swift, who doesn't want to be on Spotify because she supposedly doesn't like the fact that Spotify has a free service, that she doesn't get as much money out of the free advertising funded service. So I think she's going to be one of the high profile sign-ups for Apple Music for that reason, and there'll probably be a few others in there as well who don't want to support that Spotify model.
Yeah, but that brings us back to the classic point that we've made about streaming video services, which is nobody's got everything you want.
No one's
Apple
ever
Music
got everything you want
either.
No.
But I guess that will also kind of come down to your tastes in this matter. If I was Spotify, though, or if I was Pandora or Rdio or Deezer, because there's bunches of these things around, I'm not necessarily too worried. Apple has played in some of these spaces before, because there's also a social component to Apple Music, and it of course tried with Ping to launch a social music thing that just died.
No, it did.
And it could well be, it could well be that even though it's got this kind of huge embedded user base, that it's entering this market perhaps just a little bit too late, perhaps not quite differentiated enough to make a serious dent in that kind of market. So Adam, Game of Thrones Season 5 is over, which means those who've been watching on Foxtel have had their fix of rape, murder and assorted horrible acts that seem to draw in huge viewing figures. But if you haven't been watching on Foxtel, you've now got more legal opportunities to watch the season, haven't you?
Yeah, well, it kind of seems to change a little bit from year to year. A couple of years ago, Game of Thrones would screen on a Monday, then the next day you could buy that episode from iTunes or Google Play or somewhere like that. Then HBO and Foxtel signed a deal which said that none of those other providers could offer any of the series until Foxtel had screened all 10. So Foxtel would screen the last episode on the Monday, the Tuesday they'd all go up. Now, this to me was a bit of a short-term plan because what you're doing is actually driving a lot of people back to piracy. Now, the interesting thing is obviously Apple wasn't happy with this deal either, because last year Game of Thrones finished on the Monday. On the Tuesday, Google Play and QuickFlix and a few others had Game of Thrones. No Game of Thrones on Apple. It didn't turn up for a couple of months. When you ask Apple, they kind of implied, we're not really allowed to have it. So you go to the distributor who says, no, that's not true. Anybody who wants to show it's got rights to show it. So no one would kind of come clean on why it wasn't there, but Apple made its customers wait for a couple of months before they could watch Game of Thrones. Again, probably driving more people to piracy. This year, it's
money changed hands.
This year, it's interesting because Apple has quietly done a reversal on what it quietly did last year, and so this year, Game of Thrones.
Apple does not comment on its quiet reversals.
Yes, obviously. Apple will not comment on what it will not comment on. Yeah, this year, Game of Thrones finished on a Monday. Tuesday, it was there on QuickFlix, it was there on Google Play, and it was there on the iTunes Store. So they've obviously decided that for whatever reason, whatever strategy they had in mind last year when they decided to make people wait, they weren't going to do that again. I think it was a little bit of a power struggle between Apple and Foxtel and HBO over who wears the pants. and I think Apple was probably going to come off second in something like that, which is not used to happening. Then I think this year it's just gone fine, right? We're going to throw it up with everybody else because Apple's just throwing away customers and it's just handing people over to the BitTorrent channel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think the interesting thing here, if you want to go down the legal road, and I mean, we're yet to see exactly where the piracy figures sit on that last episode, but I think it's pretty easy to say, yeah, they're probably pretty high. It's interesting to note that the pricing for Google Play or for iTunes, which is identical in Australia, is still actually cheaper than the Foxtel equivalent of getting it week by week. Now, you still can't compete, of course, with piracy because it's very difficult to compete with free. But if you do want to go down that legal road, there's quite a nice way to kind of pick that entire season up and binge watch it if you like, bearing in mind that outside of HBO's own streaming service that they don't offer here, there's no other way to binge watch it. It's not on Netflix. It never will be.
No, because Netflix and HBO hate each other's guts. The problem with that, though, is that you have to stick your fingers in your ears for 10 weeks and go, la, 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 while everybody else talks about who died in Game of Thrones and you don't want to find out. You kind of, have to live under a rock for 3 months, which is, easier for some people than others, but I can understand if people don't want to do that.
I think though, and this is just anecdotal. Other people's experiences might have been different. I think in relation to Game of Thrones, though, I think that has been lessening over time. The whole issue of spoiling the Red Wedding, and I'm not going to say what happened there, just in case you're a season or two behind. But the whole issue of spoiling a big event like that, just hasn't seemed to have been the case to the same extent with this season, which could of course point to perhaps viewers getting a little bit turned off by some of the more extreme events, again not wanting to spoil too much, that have happened in this past season. A little bit of fatigue creeping in there, you reckon?
No, but partly also if you look at all 10 episodes, apart from the last episode, there wasn't really the high profile, oh my god sort of moment that you had in some of the earlier seasons. So there was less reason for people to... We might have to agree to
disagree on that one.
They're not quite of the same... There were a few, but I wouldn't say that there was much, short of the last episode, that was on the same caliber as a Red Wedding kind of event. So while it's nice to give people the benefit of the doubt and thinking that they're trying to stop being jerks and do the right thing, it might be just that they didn't think it was worth screaming about, considering the body count was a bit lower this season than other seasons. And that just about wraps it up for another episode of Vertical Hole. Thanks for joining us, and if you've got any feedback, hit us up on the YouTube comments on Facebook or on Twitter.
Thanks for watching, and remember, if you like what you see, punch that subscribe button.